Good evening, boys and girls. The found footage technique. Why do people seem to hate it so much? I personally do not understand why people hate it so much. I think it actually offers filmmakers, and especially independent filmmakers, the chance to really explore the edges of the film medium and to push it into new areas because it forces you to be creative with your technique. Let's not get ahead of ourselves though, because we're going to talk a little bit about the found footage form, why it works, why I think what all it can teach us about how to make films better, even if we're not making found footage films. They teach lessons that we can learn from, and what all we can do to just tell stories in a more unique way. Now, for starters, I will not be talking about mockumentary films, even though this is a damn good one, Lolly Love, directed by Jenna Fisher and starring her and her then husband James Gunn, and signed by Lloyd Kaufman. Um, yeah, I'm not going to be talking about mockumentaries because one, mockumentaries deserve their own video because they're a pretty unique subgenre within, well, comedy for sure, hence the term mockumentary, which I would distinguish from fake documentary. But mockumentaries generally are more deliberately constructed as documentaries that also just happen to be funny or be about, fictionalized humorous situations. But the fact that they're more deliberately formulated as a documentary, meaning that, this was assembled by the person who made it, presumably, and was meant to be watched as a documentary. It just happens to be funny and not real. But yeah, we're not going to be talking about that. And we're not going to be talking about films like, say, a Serbian film, which, this is a feature, normal, like, feature-length film, stylistically, that happens to have footage that is recovered and viewed as a storytelling device, but it is not through the lens of, like, the singular lens of the camera. It's not in that fixed perspective. It doesn't give you that subjectivity, which is part of what defines found footage. And yes, indeed, it is found. It is not edited together in any kind of way, but we don't get that subjectivity. We don't get that singular point of reference. It's just a storytelling device. So I don't think that that counts. Because if you were to talk about that, then you would have to put in like any film about filmmaking of any kind ever made, because technically that is footage that one may stumble upon or one may view, and it's like, well, that doesn't count. Um, but we got plenty here to talk about, and these are all just ones that I happen to own. There are a ton more that I don't have that I will want to have in the future. But in order to talk about the found footage genre, we got to go back, all the way back to 1980. Which, again, I don't know if this counts as the very first one, but it definitely is credited as being the one that pioneered the found footage genre, which we've talked about a couple times already. Cannibal Holocaust, and we've already talked about the cannibalism aspects, the animal cruelty, all that stuff. Specifically, what I'm going to talk about here is the fact that, most of this film is kind of standard narrative film, with narrative film techniques, with the notable exception of the segments that are shown through the lens of the documentary film crew and their cameras. Um, Now, this film, on top of being really shocking and, getting the director into legal trouble, getting him arrested because they thought he committed murder, made a real snuff film, all that stuff. On top of all that, this film has a very unusual structure. It does not conform to usual cinematic structure, which I found very refreshing. And part of why that is not only the script on the script level, but also that for most of the movie, it's done, kind of conventional film style, and then, like, after the halfway point, that's where you get a good chunk of it where you watch through the lens of the documentary film crew who commit a lot of atrocities towards the natives, and then they get their just end at the hands of the cannibalistic natives. Now, this one I don't think you can call found footage through and through, and it definitely is more, well, it's a, they're shooting a documentary, and it's a, fiction film, so it's kind of part fake documentary, part fake conventional, just normal conventional film in its technique, and part, groundbreaking, revolutionary new way of making movies. All of which is wrapped up in an unconventional structure that, and within a subject matter and within scenes that really push buttons and push boundaries and, get the film medium to progress in some way. So while this isn't really found footage in the way that we know it today, it most definitely helps set the groundwork for it, and it's worth a mention. And I think just the fact that the director was arrested and that people thought it was real, I think that really says a lot about the power of the technique and how, important it was to get that groundwork started. Now, I do not have the last broadcast in my collection, partially because I just need to grab it. It's not on Blu-ray as far as I know, and plus, I remembered thinking it was good up until the end. I thought the end was kind of a cop-out because it's one of those things where it does not stick with its subjective view, found footage, sticking in the lens of the camera. What we're seeing through the camera is really happening and is, like, there's no objective, godlike camera that is in every other movie that is not found footage or a documentary. It kind of it cheats itself out of that. So I don't have it, so I can't talk about it. And B, it's just not a great example, even though it is still important for film history because it was simulcast via satellite in the few theaters that would show it, which was pretty unique for the time. And that one came before the film that launched. Well, it didn't really launch the found footage form in quite the same way as another film would, but it most definitely conquered. It was kind of the Halloween of the John Carpenter's Halloween. It was that for what that did for the slasher genre, the Blair Witch Project did for found footage as a technique. Now, the Blair Witch Project, it is, whenever you say found footage, people immediately think of this or Paranormal Activity, and for good reason, because this film was so revolutionary. It was not only, it didn't start found footage as we know, but it really did. All the elements that we think of when we think of found footage, they all came together all in this one movie, plus the fact that this film, if there's one thing that this thing did pioneer, it was viral marketing and internet marketing. And again, this is why the independents, the fringes, this is why they're so important, because they were laying the groundwork for this film years before they ever shot a frame of it, and years before it ever came out. They were creating a whole mythos for it. They were creating all these fake news articles and missing persons ads, and they made, once they got acquired by Artisan, they made these documentaries that aired on the Sci-Fi Channel before the movie actually came out to help seed the idea into people's heads that this was all real. And this was when the internet was in its infancy, and back before internet culture as we know it today, before that really existed, and yet people were still beginning to understand the power of the internet to disseminate information and to also market a film. And so part of it was the technique, part of it was the marketing, and part of it was that at least for me, the filmmaking itself created so much tension and so much mystery and so much, it's sort of like the, not the movie, but the concept of cabin fever, except you're not in a cabin, you're in the middle of nowhere in the woods. So it's kind of like the opposite of cabin fever, where instead of being locked in to a narrow space, you're stuck in the middle of nowhere with no concept of where you're going. And so, but you still feel trapped and like you can't get out, and you can't trust your friends, and your survival kits are your supplies, they're disappearing every night, and you don't know why it's happening. I think it's a masterclass of mystery and how to do a found footage film. And the reason why it is found footage is because these are student filmmakers out there trying to document the Blair Witch, and there's a reason why there is footage. There's a reason why they're capturing all this stuff. The reasons are not artificially generated. They're not. They make perfect sense relative to the characters' motivations. And one of the other big elements of found footage is the fact that usually they end when the people get killed or when the camera turns off or something like that. They tend not to have like these kind of perfect endings. They tend to end rather abruptly. And part of why they're found footage instead of a fake documentary is because they were found and assembled by someone else rather than the people who actually shot it for their intended purpose. And so that's a pretty key element that separates it from a fake documentary. Um, this film, like, it did divide some people. Like, some people thought it was gimmicky or they didn't think it was scary. They thought it was boring. They, whatever they thought. I mean, but that's to be expected when you got something that's really revolutionary. But the fact is, this film was a monster hit, especially relative to how little it cost to make. This has one of the best ROIs for any film in history. And I think there's a lot you could learn from that. But part of it was not only that I think it was a really well done film and with a lot of tension and a lot of imagination, but also because I think it embraced the newness of the marketing techniques that were available to them at the time, and it did things that people hadn't done before. Even though found footage as a form, it had been done in some way or another, but this really did bring it all together, and with the viral marketing and with just the effectiveness of it, it did create a truly, in a lot of ways, kind of unparalleled piece of cinema for what it is. So, yeah, there's a reason why this is so fondly remembered. It really was kind of like how people talk about like a seminal album, like a Beatles album or something. For found footage films, the Blair Witch Project is one of those. It's kind of like the Sgt. Pepper of or the White Album of found footage, and in some ways of horror, kind of one of those foundational films that so many other films they ascend from that point. But amusingly enough, for as influential as the Blair Witch Project, as influential as it would be, I just remembered a film that in my collection that I want to talk about. Where are you? There you are. Sorry about that. Yeah, I forgot to add one to the list. As much of a groundbreaking film as it was, and as much as it did eventually launch 1,000 other films, it did not do so all at one time. Part of it was, what all it did was not just the fact that it was found footage, but the fact that they had done their homework to where they built up all of the mystery and the belief in people's minds that it was all real, to the point where I assume Artisan, they had some other generic horror film in the works, and they just slapped the name Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2 on it. It was probably just called Book of Shadows, but then they slapped Blair Witch 2 on there and shot a few, or they incorporated some news segments from the real world, and they, try to connect the two, make a quickie sequel, even though it wasn't found footage. And I think that was part of what diluted the phenomenon and some of the franchise potential of it. Even though the Blair Witch universe, it did continue in the form of video games and novelizations and, the one shitty non-found footage sequel, and eventually in 2016, the actual found footage sequel 16 years later, just called Blair Witch, which tried to kind of revive the series. The mainstream didn't really like this one that much. I thought that it, you could say it was kind of late in the game as far as found footage goes, but for fans of the original, I think this, technique-wise, it seemed like a worthy follow-up, at least to me. And it also, I think, kind of expanded the mythos quite a lot. I think the Blair Witch mythos is something that, in the eyes of the mainstream, the mythos was never really what brought them to it. What brought them to the series was just the novelty of it. But for horror fans, I think the Blair Witch mythos is such that it hasn't really been explored enough, I don't think, and it hasn't been talked to death enough, even though there is quite a lot to it. it's well worth researching and delving into if you would like to, because there's a lot of work that went into it. But yeah, I think if this had been the first sequel instead of Blair Witch 2, then I think this would have got, and if it had come out, a lot sooner to the original, then 16 years later, I think it would have done better financially, and it would have been better received commercially. It also didn't help that Eduardo Sanchez and the other co-director, Daniel Myrick, it didn't help that they, after having struck gold with Blair Witch, it didn't really help that they were not quite able to parlay it into the kind of success that you would hope they would. I mean, they did do other things, and one of which, Eduardo Sanchez contributed to VHS 2, which we'll talk about in a bit. Um, you know, they weren't able to really parlay it into quite, like, they didn't really become like the next Wes Cravens or John Carpenters like you would have hoped they would be. Unlike someone that came along later, well, actually two, now that I think of it, two people that came along later who were able to parlay their success in the found footage technique. They were able to parlay it into success in other more conventional film narrative genres and techniques. The first of which, okay, so the original Paranormal Activity, it came out on the festival circuit in 2007. It did not receive a wide release until it was acquired by Paramount, and they shot a few new scenes, and then they did a method of request the movie into your theater and we'll put it there, that kind of model for screenings. And that didn't take place until 2009. It was not a usual wide release, and that was pretty unique about it. But chronologically, this did come first on the festival circuit, but in terms of wide release and in terms of when the general public would have been able to see it, another Paramount film was Cloverfield. That came out in January of 2008. And so I'm talking about this first because in terms of what the general public would have seen, this came first. But this film was Matt Reeves, who would later go on to do Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, War for the Planet of the Apes, and then eventually The Batman. And this film was 9 years after Blair Witch 1. And there had been some other found footage films in between then, which actually, that just reminds me, one of which was Diary of the Dead by George Romero. And, this film was his attempt to try and correct some of the aspects of the found footage form that he didn't like. And in so doing, I think he did some things that were interesting, but on the whole, his narrative film origins, I think, kind of showed a little too much to where it wasn't the best found footage film technique-wise as it could be. There's an interesting film about new media. It's an interesting film about new media and about kind of emerging kind of amateur journalism and the early days of like the blogosphere and the information age, how it it punches holes in the conventional news narratives, but then also because it dilutes that narrative, it does generate much of the noise, and that's only gotten worse with social media and with the fact that people can't agree on basic facts about the world anymore, and we have to constantly be vigilant of fake news and what even is that, is it actually false stories, or is it just things that one person doesn't want to hear that they decry as fake news, all that stuff. This did foreshadow a lot of that stuff. Just as a found footage film, it's not as skillful as it perhaps could have been, but that one was not as wide of a release or as impactful as Cloverfield, but it does deserve a mention because it did foreshadow a lot. But with Cloverfield, this was more of a wide release, and this did it helped to kind of reintroduce the concept of found footage into the mainstream. And this had a halfway decent budget. Now, it wasn't massive, but it was enough to really generate interest. Plus the fact that, you had this iconic poster that is, in a way, it's kind of like the modern equivalent of the Planet of the Apes iconography. except kind of in reverse. Instead of the head of the Statue of Liberty, it's a headless Statue of Liberty. Um, and here it also, this wouldn't exist without Godzilla and other kaiju films, so that's pretty interesting, except that it's from a pedestrian's perspective, and it's where they don't know what's going on or why. So there's that tension. Now, it did get you up in the air with people jumping across skyscrapers and stuff. So there was some accusations of motion sickness, and I don't normally feel that way, but this did kind of make me a little nauseous, which I don't normally do. But I remembered people were talking about this when it came out. It made a bit of a splash, and it did just help to kind of reintroduce that form to people that hadn't seen it in the mainstream for quite some time. Because the Diary of the Dead, it was not really that mainstream or wide of a release. I think it was actually direct to DVD, if I'm not mistaken. And then, of course, around like September, October 2009, you had the first of the 6 Paranormal Activity films, and I guess that they're going to make more. But it was someone that I'm Facebook friends with, Oren Pelly, who did not come from the world of filmmaking. He's done a lot of entrepreneurship and has continued to do so even after having made a bunch of hit films and helped produce other hit films and stuff. He's left the film business and has gone to like app development and things, but what he created here, it was more than the sum of its parts, because again, in terms of budget, in terms of ROI, I think this is number 1 in terms of highest grossing film relative to what it cost to make. And it did start a franchise, more so than even Blair Witch did, because the most that it's got is 3 films and some spin-off novels and games and things. Paranormal Activity, it spawned 6 movies, and I think they're going to make more eventually. But yeah, the first film of this, I think the second one, at least for me, that one was my favorite. I think it was scarier than the first one, and I think the characters were more likable. And I think it was kind of what I had wanted from it in terms of intensity and everything. The first one definitely laid the groundwork, and it was the most essential for establishing the lore of this series. I just remembered thinking that Mika was really unlikable, and you had to kind of watch that relationship degenerate and watch him being really unsupportive and just asshole-ish to kind of drive the plot forward, which, I know that that's part and parcel of a lot of horror films. But, it's something that I think this film, it definitely started something that was much greater than the first film just in and of itself. Now, granted, the stars of the film, they never really quite took off as like leading men or women. But Oren Pelly, he didn't really direct all that many other films, but he did produce many more films that were in either the found footage or just the horror genres or techniques. And so, it definitely helped propel him into horror film superstardom. And, it just reintroduced, again, it introduced the found footage form to the mainstream in a way that they hadn't seen before, and this one was the one that launched 1,000 copycats and 1,000 imitators, even more so than Blair Witch did. Blair Witch did spawn a lot of spoofs, but it just didn't quite, as far as like changing the marketplace and changing the way that films are made, the kinds of films that are made, that was one that definitely did that. And you got some interesting films that came to the table, and some of which were well received, some of which were not. You got some like The Last Exorcism, which I remembered liking up until the end, but this was one that was trying to tackle exorcism in a way that it hadn't been done before. I need to get The Devil Inside. I remembered, I don't hate that movie like everyone else does. Like, it's not the best found footage film I've ever seen, but it's nowhere near the worst. But, like, this did kind of start a trend for found footage films, or the Paranormal Activity started the trend that this continued as far as found footage films generally speaking, they revolved around the supernatural. And there's another one that I forgot to bring into the pile here. There it is. But this is one of the films that kind of continued that trend. But I don't know why, but for whatever reason, they decided to do a conventional narrative film with the sequel. For whatever reason, there also was a studio change. It says Studio Canal and Lionsgate here, and then it says Sony here, so that could be a reason. But so you got some evolution of the form there. And then you've got one that I remembered people, when it came out, they really didn't like it, and I've never understood the reason why, but it was Apollo 18. I thought this one actually was pretty unique. Now, sci-fi and found footage had been done before, like with Cloverfield, but this film, it did something that, we hadn't really seen, as far as, like, trying to make the audience believe that you really were in space and you were on a lost moon mission, and covered up one, and why we never went back to the moon, and that sort of thing. I think this film, what makes it stand out to me is the fact that, well, it does sufficiently emulate the look of those old film cameras that the astronauts really used when they did their lunar missions. And also, there's a reason for why all those cameras are there and why they're recording, because the real astronauts, they did record quite a lot of their missions because, well, it was for history, for posterity. And so there's a good reason as to why they would have all those cameras around, because as much as I love the Paranormal Activity series, some of the reasons for why they set up cameras all over the place and why they set up as many as they do, some of those reasons get stretched thinner and thinner in terms of logic. But this, I think, is one of the more plausible reasons why these people would have cameras everywhere. Plus the fact that it did some. I think it was pretty spooky. I mean, I think outer space, because of things like Star Wars and Star Trek and stuff, we don't really think of outer space as being terrifying, but like this, and also Gravity that came 2 years later, it really helped to reinforce just how terrifying outer space really is. And I don't think people really think about that as much as they should, and I think this is a good one to do that. I think it's underrated. I think you should check it out. I don't know why people don't like it. I don't know why people don't like found footage in general. And I'll get to some of the reasons why I think they don't, but I think one of the reasons why I love the technique is because it does make you think of different ways to tell a story and different types of stories that can be told, and I'll further expound upon that as we go. Now, a good example of how that can be done really, really well is in Chronicle, which this was a sci-fi slash superhero film, original superhero film that was found footage done by Josh Trank, who would later go on to do Fantastic Four 2015, also known as Fant Four Stick, which most people hate, and yeah, it's not perfect, it's pretty flawed, but I liked what it was going for. It didn't really get there all the way. There's a lot of studio interference, but he really showed his stuff with this film. Not a big budgeted film, but it did really well relative to what it cost to make, and it was something that I think the reason why the cameras are here in the way that they are is because you have a character who is simultaneously self-loathing at first, but then once he is powerful, then he becomes he has a superiority complex and even kind of a social Darwinist streak, kind of like almost like a Magneto kind of streak about him. And Dane DeHaan, did a great job in this. The only thing that I remembered, and it also kind of gives you that first-person perspective of what it would be like to have powers, and also the limitations and the parts of having powers that wouldn't be so great. Because when they get powers, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. They have some physical problems that come with it. But part of what's interesting, so he has cameras everywhere surrounding him because he does have something of a narcissism problem once he actually gets power. The only part that did sort of jump the shark in terms of credibility was when he surrounds himself with a bunch of cell phones that are all recording at the same time, just so you can get multiple angles of the same flying fight, kind of like a Dragon Ball Z fight. And I get why it was there storytelling wise, and I guess you could justify it by saying that he wants to be watched, he wants to be admired. That did kind of stretch credibility a little bit, just because the aspect ratios are not at all what those cameras would generate, nor was the quality. The quality is way too good for what those kinds of cameras could generate, but still very unique, interesting way to tell the story, and the technique helps to tell us more about the character and his state of mind. And as I am going along, I am realizing just how many films I forgot to bring out as I'm recording the video, but that's okay. Speaking of narcissism and speaking of other genres that began to embrace the found footage form around this time, I remembered seeing a trailer for this film when I saw Chronicle in the theater with friends, and it was Project X. And this was a comedy. This was pre A Haunted House and A Haunted House 2, which I have not seen, and I'm not really, looking forward to it. But yeah, so you had Project X. This was a comedy that it helped to, like it says, from producer Todd Phillips, the director of The Hangover, and eventually the director of Joker, which I was like, wow, what a jump there that was. But Project X, this was a film that it did not really. I think it made some decent money and everything, but it was not. It was not that critically well received, and then and audiences were kind of on it. I know some people that really loved it, and then other people that were like, "Oh, the characters are misogynistic. They're pigs. They're unlikable. They're this. They're that." And that's all true, except that's what I liked about it because, and just to give you a little taste of what I'm trying to talk about when it comes to found footage, because you have something of a, well, semi-documentary remove from your subjects, because you're not the godlike camera that most films use, because you have subjectivity, because you have being there on the ground in the moment with the characters, like you really are among them, like you are them in some way, because you're seeing through their eyes, then it helps place you in their mindset and in their world more thoroughly than something else might. And so when you are in the shoes of people that are unlikable or misogynistic or chaotic, they want to party and destroy and all that stuff. When you're in that place, I think it does put the viewers into an uncanny space that they may not be used to where they have to decide what they're going to feel about it. And again, the documentary remove helps to make it not feel as manipulative as a more conventional film might be, because you're presented what you're presented and you get to decide how you're going to feel about it. And I tend to like films that do that, even if they're conventional narrative films, rather than your usual film that's there to make a point or trying to, which I love films that make points, don't get me wrong, I love that, but there is something to be said for just presenting people as they are and letting the audience decide if they're going to like them or not. I think Scorsese does that really well with gangsters and with other criminals and people. There's something to be said for that. I think this film does that in a documentary kind of remove, plus the fact that it's a comedy, and I personally found it rather unnerving because it was so in the moment and because the characters are so unlikable, because the things gets out of control. Now, they do face the consequences for what they're doing. It's not like Ferris Bueller's Day Off where they get away with it scot-free. They do pay pretty heavy consequences for it, and it does get absolutely out of control. It gets into pure anarchy, pretty much. And this came before The Purge, too. But it's such that I think it shows beyond a shadow of a doubt how a lot of the leading men in a lot of conventional comedies at least to me, they could be quite unlikable. They could be quite, misogynistic, or embody a lot of unlikable traits. It's just that in those movies, those are seen as good things or as acceptable things, or like these are characters that are like your friends or whatever. These are relatable experiences, and maybe that's true for you. But this film, I think, I'm not sure it necessarily sees that as a good or bad thing. Like, I think, the film might want to say, that, oh, maybe you want this to happen, maybe you want the ultimate party or whatever. And I'm sure that some people took it that way. Me approaching it the way I did through the lens that I have, I think that it helped to show just how out of control unrestrained, unfettered youth can be, and also just how, well, unlikable a lot of people and a lot of men can be, um, and especially when it's presented as comedy, it makes you think. I think it makes you think beyond what most people would say, relative to what other films can do or what other films purport to do, whatever. I think a lot of films that aren't like messagey movies can actually tell you more about the human condition than a lot of like really preachy films can. A good example of that, another really underrated film that I totally forgot to take off the shelf until I started recording, was As Above, So Below. This is a film that it's basically like if you made a found footage Tomb Raider movie, basically. That's kind of how I look at it. And but with supernatural elements, and specifically it touches on elements of magic and occultism, and not in the usual like satanic way that most people think of that stuff, which magic and Satanism and all that stuff, like those are all very, very different things. But this touches on some ideas that are magical, and yeah, touches on like the Philosopher's Stone, and on the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm, and also the power of will, which magic is a lot about will, from what I understand. That it's as above, so below, and then the rest of the quote in the movie is, "It's as above, so below, as I believe the world to be, so it is." And so a lot of it is about that central idea in different occultic traditions or in magical traditions, that your imagination, your will, your belief about yourself and the world around you, that they can be one and the same, and that you can allow the power of your imagination to affect the world around you. I think it touches on that very well. Plus, it also touches on Dante's Inferno, and on different ideas about kind of having to go through hell to get back out, basically, which is also lifted from Dante's Inferno. And also, what's down is up and what's up is down. There are a lot of really, really fascinating ideas that are explored in the visuals and in the artwork of this film. And again, a lot of people didn't pick up on that because people, A, are not very smart or not very observant, especially when it comes to found footage films, and B, I think people, they must not want to look for sophistication or want to see what's there, at least as far as I can tell. Especially when it's in a form that they don't really understand or expect. But this is a really good one that deserves a lot more in-depth analysis, specifically through that kind of comparative religion, occult, hermetic, and magical, through that lens. And then those are 2014 ones. This is another 2014 film. Um, it was one that Eli Roth actually really loved and supported, and thought that it was underrated, and I agree, devils do. It's basically Rosemary's Baby, except with a more proactive protagonist, and different setting, where instead of it being all about your neighbors and your loved ones and your family that you can't trust and that are gaslighting you, instead of that, it's all about going to this foreign country, this unfamiliar place, getting pregnant, and acting irrationally and acting demonic and everything. There's just it's a different set of it's different conceit, but similar. And again, the found footage aspect makes it more immediate. I want to watch this again. It has been forever, but I remembered really liking it. I need to find the slipcover for it. But this is definitely underrated. I think it's worth a watch. And again, I don't have The Devil Inside, but that's one that people really, really hate because it does end rather abruptly. And people thought that, oh, we're in the middle, the second act now, we're not in the third act. And I could see where they're coming from. Like, it could have been longer, it could have been better. It's not like the best found footage film I've ever seen, but I've also seen ones that are more indie that are far, far worse than that. But yeah, I don't have it in the collection to talk about. And then we can talk about, speaking of ones that are a little bit more off the beaten path, you have The Houses October Built 1 and 2. I've not seen the second one yet, but I will. The first one was really cool because it was all about haunted houses, like haunted house attractions, the ones that people create and they dress up and they pop out to scare you and everything, and how extreme those can be, how backwoodsy they can be, how some of the more extreme ones, like how there's not really a lot of regulation or oversight, and how, and I know there are a lot of real haunted houses that, they make you sign waivers and stuff because of how it can shock you to the point of, like, you could get a heart attack, you could faint, you could do any number of things. So they want to make sure that their asses are protected, and so it kind of explores that. And I think a lot of the places that they go to are real establishments, but they meet some unsavory characters along the way. So a pretty cool premise for a found footage film. And now talking about the creativity aspect of it, we've already touched on some different plots, some different conceits. um, I'm going to talk about horror anthologies last, just because those don't really have a singular cohesive plot. But I think that these last three that I have that are more singularly plot driven, they have some different things that they can teach us about just how to construct a story. The first of which is, what do you do when it's from the villain's perspective, and that is Hangman right here. I really, really love this film because the person with the camera is the villain, is the antagonist, and he's the killer. So there's a reason why he set up these cameras all over the place, because he's wanting to spy on the family in order to best kill him. And he has a thing for for the mother, for the wife of this family, and so you get the voyeuristic aspects of it, and you also get the feeling of dread and the feeling of violation, because it is the bad guy doing it. It's not the good guys doing it to themselves to try and catch a supernatural force or something. It's a very human killer. It's a very human person who's doing this for very down to earth kind of human reasons, albeit very, sadistic, cruel, murderous ones, but they're still human in the sense that they're not supernatural. But highly recommend this because you see some of that subjectivity. It's basically like if the Tooth Fairy or Buffalo Bill from either Red Dragon or Silence of the Lambs, it's like if one of those killers, if he did his own little found footage movie. And, this is a great example of just how to do that kind of subjectivity and that point of view, how to do that really, really well from the point of view of the villain. And yet again, another film that I forgot to bring out that's right behind me, that does that also in a very, very different sense. Talk about avant-garde. Director's Cut, directed by Adam Rifkin, written by Penn Jillette, who's a big hero of mine in a lot of different ways. He acts in it, he narrates it, and it's about someone who wins acting like a walk-on role in a crowdfunding campaign for a film. He's like an obsessed fan. He steals the film and he re-edits it according to what he thinks the film should be, and also kidnaps the starlet and makes her act in his director's cut version of the film. And there are a lot of cameos and bits from, Sean C. Phillips, who I know, but also, like, Adam Rifkin himself is in this, Teller's in it, Gilbert Gottfried's in it, a bunch of different people, and then the main starlet is, there's Lynn Shay, Nestor Carbonell, Gilbert Gottfried, Teller, Missy Pyle, that's the leading lady in this. But talk about avant-garde, talk about really pushing storytelling into new areas. Penn is someone who I just love listening to him speak about anything because I love the way his brain works, and I love the fact that every time I hear him speak, even if I don't agree with him like politically or philosophically, and usually I do, but on the rare case that I don't, even then I like hearing him speak. I like hearing what he has to say because he presents it very well, and he thinks very, very differently than most people. He very much is on the avant-garde in terms of, well, how to do magic, but also how to tell a story, how to just have a different perspective. I want to read his novel Sock. I think that'd be pretty interesting because it's like a police noir detective story, but it's with a sock monkey as the main detective. And this is a film that if you want to see why found footage is important and how it can be used to tell a unique story, look no further than this. And it's not just all about the gimmick of it. You can have a really, really good script that goes along with it, such as in The Visit, which was M. Night Shyamalan's comeback movie. And it was a good kind of back to basics exercise for him. A lot of good tension, really good acting from the child actors, good twist. It was, I think it was really, really solid, just great. Well, I think one of his best scripts that I can remember, certainly in a long time. Very funny, but very tense as well. A lot of good elements to it. I don't even want to spoil it all that much, but it's definitely worth a watch. Kind of an unconventional film. And then, of course, probably my favorite found footage film of all time, Creep. I think it's because there's a lot of really good. Well, the acting is brilliant. The premise is brilliantly creepy. It's a great commentary on how in this 21st century we don't sometimes really know how to treat each other or how to communicate to each other in a way that sometimes isn't perceived as being sociopathic, even though in here we have a character who very much is sociopathic. But before you really know that, it's like, well, is he just socially awkward or what? Or does he just not know boundaries or whatever? I've been guilty of that plenty of times in my life, and so I sympathize with people that sometimes it's kind of hard to know how to be. It's hard to know how to behave around people, especially because everyone's different and they got different lines that you can't cross, that you don't know what they are until you've crossed them, and all that stuff. But this is a good, well, statement of that, but also a good example of what to do when someone isn't actively trying to better themselves and when they're going about that kind of thing in all the wrong ways and all the different ways in which they can be a creep and be destructive and all that stuff. So, but really, really great. It's low budget. It really doesn't look like it costs very much at all to make, but it is definitely worth a watch. The second one, Creep 2, is really good. I need to get that. Need to get Fraser Park Recut, another great one. And then I also need to. I don't think it's on DVD, or if it is, I've never seen it. On DVD, but it's Be My Cat, a film for Anne. One of the most disturbing films I've ever seen in my life, and yet not terribly graphic either, which is a remarkable feat. But again, deeply disturbing film about someone who's like a sociopath and is maladjusted socially and the lengths that he'll go and all that stuff. I think, especially when it comes to men, I think that there are a lot of men who, myself included, sometimes don't always know how to be in certain situations, and so, and it's a more common problem than you would think, especially in the social media age and in the age where social skills are kind of eroding amongst all of us, and especially those that weren't like formally taught those things for whatever reason. So definitely worth a watch there. And then last but not least, just touching on some anthologies here, which I did an unboxing of these not too long ago, but the VHS series, highly recommend these films. I don't really want to go into like each individual segment because there's so many of them and they kind of vary in quality, but as a series, these are great, great anthology films, and they're amazing for found footage. There are some really good ones in the first one, and especially the second one. The second one's the most cohesive. The third one's probably the worst, but it's definitely got enough things about it to make it worth watching. So definitely give all three of those films a watch if you want to see just some different ways to be imaginative with your horror. And last but not least, my good friend Tony Newton, having helped produce and assemble this collection, Faces of Snuff, here, which is all about snuff films and kind of imitating the supposed look and style of snuff films as they're purported to be. You know, what the urban legends surrounding them, you know, what they're supposed to be like. Very good, very underrated, very, you know, it's with Wild Eye Entertainment, it's with their Raw label, and it's very raw. There are actually some, what appear to be, and I'm pretty sure are, some actually unsimulated sex in this, like, I don't know who did it, which of the filmmakers did this particular segment, but, like, there are, it's like a porn film that goes wrong and the subject dies on camera, but like there's actual like penetration and the guy's, you know, erect and everything, and it's like, wow, you know, the Emmanuel and the Last Cannibals didn't even do that, so it's like, well, you know, good on you for going all the way with it. But anyway, yeah, so those are some of the found footage films I have. And hopefully it's been kind of self-evident throughout the course of this thing, but I think that the found footage genre is ripe with creative possibilities on how to tell a story in a new, unique way that it hasn't been told before, and especially new ways to market a film, new ways to tell a story, new perspectives, getting into the subjectivity angle of storytelling, which, you know, conventional narrative films can do that, especially if you hear narration from a character, especially if it's like very deliberately through their eyes, and if they're an unreliable narrator, like A Clockwork Orange or like American Psycho, you know, but it can put you in there without needing that narration. Now, it does have a more objectivity than something that has narration does, but it also has more of a remove from, like, it's subjective, but it's also got a bit of a remove, as opposed to narrative film with, like, a godlike camera where you're shown a very directed experience where a filmmaker is wanting to take you on a particular journey. Whereas with found footage, much of the time you are able to more justifiably judge the characters for yourself. And I like that a lot. I think that I like films that allow me, the viewer, to decide what I'm going to feel about them, and that they don't have to manipulate me into feeling a certain way about something necessarily. But I think that it's also just, it forces you to think about just different ideas about cinematography and about acting styles, because people like to criticize the acting in found footage films as bad or whatever. I would argue quite the opposite. I think found footage films have some of the most realistic acting I've ever seen in films, because they come from that improvisational kind of John Cassavetes style of Andy Warhol style of filmmaking, where it's very loose, it's very off the cuff, it's very it's like real life. You know, people don't have a script to go from. You know, they don't work off a script in real life. They may have an idea of what they want to say, but people do not have beautifully eloquent modes of speech. They have verbal hiccups, like I did just then. They forget what they're going to say. They freak out. You know, they don't look especially dignified when they cry. They might behave irrationally. They don't necessarily have, like, Christopher Nolan-esque poetic bits of advice to share, you know, that are beautifully worded and all that stuff. All of that, and they don't have the sexy cry where they have the singular tear down the cheek. They don't have any of those artifices of film acting that people just accept as real. So when they see people that are acting more real, and more like real people that they would see, I think there must be something that it doesn't really connect in their brains. They're like, I'm seeing this on the big screen, but it's not what I'm used to. This isn't computing. But I think that if you embrace more, well, good, like people who can do improv well, who also, like Christopher Walken, he famously said that usually what I do is I don't read the script, because eventually we're gonna find out what the movie is anyway. You go see what the script is anyway. You go see the movie, And I just focus on what I'm doing and try not to get mixed up by the facts too much because you're going to find out what they are anyway. And in doing that, I find that I make odd choices, things that I wouldn't normally think of if I was going along a linear path. And and he talks about that, and also talks about the fact that this is all from his Inside the Actor Studio appearance. Um, he talks about like you and I, a glass drops and we go to pick it up, and all of a sudden the scene becomes alive, and I don't know what you're going to say to me. You don't know what I'm going to say to you. It's that element of life interfering, and it's so true. So I think that even if you're not making a found footage film, if you're just doing a conventional narrative film, the more that you can bring that sense of not knowing and spontaneity and improvisation to your film, then I think it can be more real and certainly less typical. Now, there are people who can't really do improv well, and I'm sure that's probably why they don't like to do that. But, people that embrace the unknown, or they embrace the accident, the happy accidents, then, you can make magic. And it also, found footage films will teach you how to think visually, how to place the camera in places that it would normally go, especially because the camera work is more loose, more consumer, more it's less perfect because life is not perfect, and so yeah, it really opens up your mind if you're open to it, and I think it allows the viewers to decide for themselves how they're going to feel about characters if you do your homework well enough in setting those characters up. And yeah, it allows you to beat the doldrums and the conventionalities of usual typical cinema, which we need more of. Even if you're not making a found footage film, if you can transfer some of those techniques over to your conventional film, then I think we will all be better off for it. So hopefully you found this interesting. If you like this, then please like, share, subscribe, hit the bell icon, set phasers to stun, warp factor 5. If you like these kinds of videos, please tell me. I'll continue to make more of them. And yeah, so please go out there and make your own damn found footage movie, and really help pioneer cinema into new directions, especially given the corona crisis we're in right now, because you can film it from your own home and your friends can film it from their own home, and you can make a movie, which is actually what I'm going to be doing with a friend of mine not too long from now. And I actually was in one like that called Dark Web Mystery Box, which the DVD of which will be arriving hopefully soon, and I'll be able to tell you more about it then, so stay tuned, and I will see you in the next video.